Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Outen, and I am the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, exhibitions, and other historical programs, advocating preservation, and providing resources to classrooms. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark finished in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson in Washington, D.C. Today's Lunch Bite features Paul Newman, who will discuss a portrait of British General Sir William Greene from our museum collections. As the chief engineer for Gibraltar prior to and during the Franco-Spanish siege of the British territory, it was Greene who designed, lobbied for, and oversaw the construction of the greater defenses of the Rock. This Lunch Bite will focus on why one of the Revolutionary War's greatest sieges was fought on the doorstep to the Mediterranean Sea, and how engineer William Greene made sure the British kept their outcrop of empire. Paul Newman is the Museum Collections and Operations Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. And Paul recently just joined the professional staff here at Anderson House in November of 2021. Hailing from Newport Pagnell, England, Paul possesses an expertise in weapons, uniforms, and other military artifacts. Prior to joining the professional staff here, Paul worked at several military museums, including the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards Museum in Edinburgh, Scotland. Shortly after, he moved to the Washington, D.C. area and worked as a tour guide at the U.S. Capitol building for nearly 4 years. Now, before I turn things over to Paul, a few housekeeping items are in order. Following today's presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit questions for Paul using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Paul Newman.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you today to discuss something that's just fascinating to me, the Siege of Gibraltar, and how it factors into the wider Revolutionary War. And we'll get into how that exactly happens along the way, because you might have a few questions about why am I doing this, why am I talking about this, and we'll discuss that. Yes, so let's get right in there. So what we have is an oil on canvas portrait of Major General, later General Sir William Greene, and it's painted by George Carter, a British artist who exhibited in the Royal Academy a little bit, and later I'll show you one of his more famous paintings, again to do with Gibraltar. And this painting was acquired by the Society of Cincinnati in 2016. Now, looking at the painting, we're going to discuss, what do we see? What is it that George Carter, the artist, is trying to get across? So immediately we can see that Greene is looking straight at the viewer. He's standing like almost completely upright, but he's leaning into his table where his books are located, and there's a map sprawled out there. With the books, there are 3 that are legible to the eye. It may not come across quite as easy where you are, but and there's one that I have to kind of squint in to see. But there's 3 that have legible names on them. One, the furthest left as you're looking at it, the furthest left, there's one that says the name Montalembert, and this is in reference to Marc René, the Marquis de Montalembert. He was a French engineer of the 18th century, a military engineer, specifically, specializing in fortifications. On the right of the pile of books, there's a spine with a red label, and that has the name Vauban written on it. That might ring some bells for you. He's the most famous of the group I'll be mentioning. So that is Sebastian de Vauban, the great fortress engineer of Louis XIV in Europe. And then the last name that we can see is on the blue binding on the right, propped up, and that says on it Cohorn. Now that's an anglicized version of Menno Cohorn. He was a Dutch engineer of the 17th century, very prevalent. So all these three men are military engineers. So this is getting across that William Green here is a studious gentleman, that he studied the great works of prior military engineers to inform his decisions on what he's doing in Gibraltar. And that's where in the top left, as you're looking at it, the top left of the painting is Gibraltar. You've got the rock there dominating the scene. The lower portion of that image, you've got the fortifications. And later we'll look at some maps of Gibraltar, so it give you a better sense, because this is only just a kind of a quick glimpse in the painting. And that's, again, just to give you the idea that William is linked to Gibraltar. His works are linked to it, and as an important milestone in his wider career. And then, of course, at the bottom left, you've got that map. So that map is showing us the fortifications specifically that are visible in the top left of the painting on the bay side of Gibraltar. That's what he's just showing there on the map. Which ends up being the kind of linchpin of his defenses of the British territory, are these bayside bastions and walls that he'll construct and improve earlier constructions. A little bit about his dress that he's wearing. Now, what looks like maybe a faded uniform is actually a silk coat, so a silk frock coat he's wearing here, rather than the traditional wool that he would be wearing in certainly in Great Britain and colder climates. But British officers of the 18th century, and actually going into the 20th century as well, were responsible for buying all their own accessories, accoutrements, weapons, and uniforms. So they had a certain flexibility, especially if they were more charismatic. They had a certain way about them that they could push the rules as much as possible to acquire what they wanted to suit them. So William Green has decided to purchase a silk coat to wear in Gibraltar because of the climate. It's warmer there on the Mediterranean, so it'll make him more comfortable. There were other known officers that did this in India, where of course the British were as well. But it doesn't seem to be too commonplace. Oh, and then lastly, on the bottom right, you've got a green table here, and it's got William Green's cocked hat, trimmed with a gold lace, black cockade, which is typical of the British army of the period, wearing their black cockades no matter the rank. And then lastly, you just can see the hilt, the guard of his small sword, which, as far as we can see, which you can only see a little bit, is quite a fine example. It looks like quite an expensive piece that he owned. So again, this is talking about the status of William Green here. All right, so who exactly was William Green? Well, William Green was born on the 4th of April, 1725 in London. He will study at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, at the Woolwich Warren. That's where he'll gain his initial experience and understanding of what this is to be a military man, first and foremost, and then to be an engineer specifically, because at Woolwich is where they're training the engineer corps and artillery. There isn't a standard military college for the British Army until late 1800s into really early 1800s, when they actually established the more famous Sandhurst up the road. And then he will go get posted initially to Portsmouth on the south coast of England. That's his first posting, where he'll be working on fortifications specifically. But he is quickly dispatched in 1745 to the War of Austrian Succession. Huge conflict erupting across the continent of Europe. You've got Prussia, you've got Britain, you've got the French involved. It'll also be fought in part in the North American colonies for the French and the British respectively. Green will be dispatched to take part in specific battles. He'll be in part taking place in some of the notable sieges of the time. So again, he's getting this experience, which will be crucial for his later time on Gibraltar. He'll be sent across to North America to study some of the fortifications for the British, and later take part in such notable actions as the battle on the Plains of Abraham, where he's actually wounded in action. And a year after his service ends in the War of Austrian Succession, in 1760, he's then dispatched to Gibraltar to become the senior engineer. So he's the top military engineer on Gibraltar. And the image I've got here on the slide is showing his report. Now, he penned this personally. It's probably his greatest achievement pre the siege, because what he's doing is he's acutely aware that he needs to make his higher ups, his senior officers back in Britain especially, aware of maybe what's lacking in Gibraltar. So he's making a case of what fortifications need to be improved and what ones need to be built and what logistics to go along with all of this has to be put in place. So he's actually dispatched back to Britain from Gibraltar for a time by his governor, who is George Eliot. George Eliot will send him back to Britain to meet with the higher ups in Whitehall in London, and he'll even have an audience with King George III. He impresses the king so much so that he'll give him the money to do the job, as well as the necessary permissions to make it happen. And unfortunately, this all survives in the British Library, and this is just the frontispiece of that piece there. So do check that out if you have time. It's quite a large document held by the library, which is online, I should say. You don't have to go there. Now let's take a step back for a moment, because you're probably thinking, well, this is the American Revolution Institute after all. Why are we talking about Gibraltar, a little tiny British possession? No offense to Gibraltarians, but a little possession in the Mediterranean. Well, the colonial rebellion that starts in New England becomes a global war. And why is that? France. France joining the war to aid the US patriots turns this from a small scale North American theater of war to a wider global war, because the French are going to be picking at the territories that they want, the ones they lost in the 7 Years' War, especially because they're remembering what happened there. And so what they do is they'll encourage the Spanish to come in on their side, because the Spanish have a big navy. And after all, the Royal Navy at this point is the largest navy in the world. And the French want the Spanish to come and help them to pick off British fleets, especially around the world, not just the North American theater, but especially around the world, like the Caribbean, Mediterranean, Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. So the Spanish and the French will sign a military alliance in April 1779. But the key thing here for the Spanish is that the French, in return for their aid, will be aware of what the Spanish want in return. So we're talking about access to the Mississippi Valley in North America, East and West Florida as well. They want to obtain those from the British. And then in the Mediterranean, in the European theater, we're looking at Gibraltar and the island of Minorca, which at this point is in British custody, as it were. So what we're having is a wider war expanding across the globe. I mentioned India briefly. The fighting will take place there. With naval actions, they'll take place all across the globe. And the flag there is one that was actually captured from the fighting at Gibraltar, Spanish flag held in the UK. So what and where is Gibraltar exactly? I'm glad you asked. The lovely engraving here, that's from our collection at the Society of Cincinnati, and that is held in our beautiful library where I'm actually speaking to you today. The illustration here is just the perfect one for illustrating what is known as the Rock. So Gibraltar, known as the Rock. Why? Because it is mostly dominated by this very large rock, effectively. Large mountain, 1,400 feet high. And to give you your bearings, what you're looking at is, this is if you're standing on the Spanish border, on the southernmost province of Spain, Andalusia, and you're looking across what is known as the isthmus, which is this a very low-lying sandy area, and you're looking towards the Rock. To the right of it, you've got, you might just see some fortifications, a little castle. That's the actual town of Gibraltar, known as Gibraltar. And then in the background, what are hills there? That's actually the North African coast, because it's important to remember that Gibraltar is just 15 miles away from North Africa. This will make a bit more sense when you see some later illustrations of this. To zoom out to the European-wide map, the little red circle in the bottom left, that's where Gibraltar is. Here we have the Iberian Peninsula, so that's Spain and Portugal. Again, a little bit closer so you can see, get your bearings. Where that on the right, where there's those yellow looking islands, Menorca's there just on the right there. So that's just help your bearings there. So that at this point, that's British as well. and then coming into the actual Straits of Gibraltar, which is the meeting of the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. You've got Gibraltar at the top, so it's a peninsula. Sometimes people think it's an island, but it's actually a peninsula connected by that what is known as an isthmus, that thin stretch of land, that neck, if you like, connecting the main portion of Gibraltar to the Spanish mainland. And then across the 15 miles there, straits, you've got North Africa. So this might be making you think about how, well, this is pretty interesting where it's located. Fundamental position for trade, for the British to keep an eye on what the Spanish and French navies are up to. It's a great location. This is why the Spanish really want it back. And then this lovely illustration, very detailed one, is actually by William Green. So William Green, being a trained engineer, he would have been taught how to sketch and design and lay out plans, because if you're going to build something, you need to know how to draw it. So this is a drawing, again, from the British Library, hand-colored by William Green. This one a little bit closer so you can see it a bit better. So you got the town in the bottom left. And as you'll see, most of the landmass that is Gibraltar is empty. It is rock, so it's not really good for building on. So the town is squished on this little piece there. And if you wondered how the British even got here in the first place, in 1704, the British with Dutch allies, actually, that's when they invaded Gibraltar, obtained it. And for just over 300 years, the British have been there. The Treaty of Utrecht, ending the War of Spanish Succession in 1713. That's when, in legal writing, the Spanish cede the territory of Gibraltar to the British. A little bit more context about Gibraltar. So I'm mentioning here June 1779. That's the eve of the siege, what is known as the Great Siege. June 1779 is actually when the Spanish will declare war against the British. The population of the town at this point is 3,000 civilians. And as you can see there, it's quite metropolitan. It's, of course, got British, it's got Genovese, there's Jewish population, there's a Portuguese population, there's a Spanish population. Prior to this siege, it was normal and commonplace for the British and the Spanish especially to mix. Officers on either side actually regularly mixed. The day that the Spanish declared war against the British, one of the British officers, the senior ones, is actually dining with his Spanish equivalent on the other side of the border. So it's only after that you have this big siege that there's a bit more animosity, because they end up seeing themselves more as equals, as professionals. They all do the same job, as it were. The garrison, though, sizable population, larger than the actual civilian population of the town, 5,400. Plus, you've got 1,400 military spouses and children there on the territory, joining their husbands. The British naval force, I just mentioned there, it's tiny for what the British really need. Here, we're just talking about one warship, 3 frigates, a sloop. Later, this is augmented by a few other things, but nothing to compete with what will end up being about 50 warships in the outside of Gibraltar that the French and the Spanish will amass by the end point of the siege. So the Great Siege begins. So when you look at sieges of Gibraltar, there's actually been 14 sieges. The Great Siege is the 14th. It's called the Great Siege because it's probably the most gigantic in its scale. The Spanish and French will end up amassing about 40,000 troops outside the gates of Gibraltar. And like I mentioned earlier, we're looking at a fleet of about 50 ships. So what is the Spanish plan? Well, as you can see in the lovely illustration there, it's to put a lot of ships outside of Gibraltar and blockade it. They'll also be doing this on land. They have earthworks there. They've got fortifications just outside on that isthmus, that neck of land outside of Gibraltar proper, where they'll blockade the British garrison. They want to starve the British garrison into submission because, as you can see, it's dominated by that huge rock. It's not the kind of place you willy-nilly want to attack. And as we'll talk about, the British will create some clever uses of the terrain to make sure that the Spanish can't get in. So life under siege, what are we talking about? Well, I've mentioned already, there were not just soldiers there. For the civilians, they had no prior training experiences to deal or prepare them for what it's like to be under cannon fire. And sadly, for 3.5 years, about 1,300 days, this siege will go on. And for these poor families on the island, on Gibraltar, on the territory, they will be on the cannonade from the Spanish almost day and night. Not to say it was easy for the British soldiers, but at least many of these would have been veterans of conflict, understood what kind of comes with this. So starvation at the top there, the list of things that everyone's having to deal with together in Gibraltar is starvation. Why is this happening? Well, Gibraltar, chiefly everything has to come by boat. With the blockade, this becomes increasingly harder and harder. That being said, though, there will be blockade runners that will come, especially from North Africa and Portugal, Portugal actually being a neutral party and a longtime ally of the British. They will send in merchant vessels. But the problem with that is you'll get inflation applied to the prices of foods and supplies, which will end up incurring great hardship for the garrison and the civilians alike, where they can't afford, and they end up having to sell things in their homes. We get disease, so we're talking about scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C, which quickly shows after about a month of a lack of vitamin C. They'll end up having things you might be familiar with tales of pirates, where the teeth will end up falling out. We'll also have an outbreak of smallpox, even affects William Green's daughter, Charlotte, who lives here with her father and mother. Her mother is Miriam. We'll have about 500 people sadly die from smallpox during the siege. Casualties, what we're looking at there is, I mentioned the cannon fire coming in. We're getting cannon balls coming in, knocking off masonry. Things are hitting people as they're trying to go about their daily business as best as they can under siege. I should say this illustration here, this lovely engraving, this is actually done by Captain Davis, British Army, just after the siege in 1793. So this is showing prior to them rebuilding, most of the town is completely leveled by the Spanish. Now, Green, how does this all relate to Green? What is he doing during the siege? Well, the construction of the Bay of Gibraltar facing defenses. I mentioned that a little bit. It's shown in our painting by George Carter. The illustration here, another one of William Green's. This is what's known as the King's Bastion, a bastion being a gun platform that juts out ahead of the main line, allowing cannons and musketeers to fire up the walls, but making it harder for their opposition to fire at them. This is one of his key linchpins of his defenses there. Bomb-proof shelters, bunkers effectively. These are 18th century bunkers. William Green will even build one in his back garden so that his wife and daughter can shelter in there. He'll build a hospital for the naval use of personnel on the province. New batteries, so batteries of artillery. He'll build these throughout the greater territory, even so much as 1,300 feet up in the air, they'll place a new battery on top of the rock. Galleries in the rock. Galleries, what I'm referring to there are the tunnels. So if you've ever heard of Gibraltar, maybe you've been there, you might have heard of the famed carved tunnels. This is when this begins during this siege. They're building tunnels within the rock of Gibraltar so that they can then fire enfilading, which is flanking fire over and onto the Spanish entrenchments. And lastly, and maybe one of his most long-lasting contributions to Gibraltar and the wider British Army, is he establishes the Military Company of Artificers. And these are military men that then are recruited within the garrison to be deployed to construct military fortifications. Prior to Green's time here on Gibraltar, it was civilian labor that did this, which never proved reliable, sadly. And so Green establishes for the first time in the British Army a professional team that are other ranks and NCOs to work under the trained engineers, being trained at Woolwich, like Green was, but these are trained other ranks, or enlisted men. Now, I've mentioned the blockade that the Spanish are putting into action. the British with the Royal Navy will actually be able to relieve the garrison at several times and resupply them. The first and probably the most interesting is what becomes known as the Moonlight Battle, where you get Admiral Rodney, who will bring his Royal Naval squadron into as close as he can to Gibraltar and actually fight the Spanish at night, hence Moonlight Battle, excuse me. And this is a scene of that action from just after it happened, just a year after. And 2 more times, the territory will be relieved. Second time a year later by Admiral Derby, which is on the left, just an illustration showing that. And on the right, you get Admiral Lord Howe, who will relieve the province in 1782. British sortie. Sortie is a term meaning raid, effectively. So it's a short, sharp action where a military force wants to get in, get out. They've got specific objectives to do. In this case, you have this lovely engraving from the Society's very own collection showing what happens in this sortie. But to give you a bit more context, by 1781, the Spanish creeping forward with their entrenchments to get as close as possible to the main part of Gibraltar, especially to the town, so they can fire their cannons into it more effectively. And so what's happening is the British, seeing there's a threat, they do a night sortie. So it's actually about 2,800 men will be sent out at night under the command of the Governor Elliot. And what you're seeing in this is, to give you perspective, where the viewer is, where you are, is you're looking over the isthmus again, but looking north to Spain. This is all the Spanish entrenchments there, and the British will go in and attempt to smash up the entrenchments effectively, the ones they can get to easily, and they'll go up to the guns and the mortars and spike them. What spiking means is you drive a nail or any kind of thin piece of metal into the touch hole where the gunpowder goes to ignite the piece. That's driven in, broken off to make the gun inoperable. And it becomes a great success of the entire siege for the British. This John Trumbull engraving actually has on the left, as you're looking at it, there's the British military and British Navy going in and literally smashing up to cause as much havoc as they can. And Elliot is there in the center. And from our very own collection, we're fortunate, as well as the green painting standing next to me, we have a Spanish model 1757 musket. The 1757 standard issue Spanish musket of this period, including the Revolutionary War. This particular gun, though, was captured during this sortie by the British and then presented to our very own William Green here. And how do we know that? Well, it tells us on the gun, fortunately for us. On the side plate here, this bronze side plate that's mounted onto the left of the musket, it simply says General William Green, Chief Engineer, and it mentions the dates of his service on Gibraltar. And then this wrist piece of bronze or escutcheon plate has the 2 names. It tells you the actual story of when and how this was taken from the sortie on the Spanish lines in November 17th, 1781. So incredible piece of provenance for a fascinating piece of the war and of military history more generally of the 18th century. Now, the culmination of the 3.5-year siege is the Franco-Spanish attack of September 1782. And what this is a mass attack using land forces, naval forces by the Franco and Spanish alliance against Gibraltar. Their plan is to get in and conquer it and end the siege there and then. They've given up with their ideas of having this long, starving operation. It's not working. So what they will do, they will deploy 47, 50 ships of the line, and then 10 floating batteries, which I'll come back to what on earth a floating battery is. But they'll deploy these assets, and then they'll have 300 landing craft, and their plan is to bombard the sea-facing defenses of Gibraltar that William Green largely designed and improved upon, make some breaches, and land those troops in there. And this, we're talking about 30,000 French and Spanish troops to be landed in those breaches, facing 7,000 British troops. So there wasn't much of a contest, but they had to get in first. The floating batteries, there's a couple here at the bottom, these very large rectangular looking objects, not quite the elegant ships we're used to seeing of the 18th century. These were purpose built, or purpose designed, I should say. They took existing warships and cut them down. They took off the top deck, the front side. So there was only guns put on the port side. This port side was then reinforced with additional timber and caulking. And then the gaps in between was filled with wet sand. Why? Is to make it super, super thick, about double the thickness of a normal hull. And the wet sand helps act against hot cannonballs coming in, because the British will deploy what they call red hot shot, what the soldiers will call hot potatoes, where they take a furnace, they have them placed next to their gun crews on their batteries in Gibraltar. They'll heat up the cannonballs, put them in the guns, and fire them off at ships. And they'll do en masse against these floating batteries. The French, actually, interestingly, will even deploy sprinkler systems of sorts on their ships here to try and mitigate that, but it just doesn't work. And 2 of the floating batteries will catch alight. They'll explode in the harbor. This is another scene here, actually, of the floating batteries coming in. But this is what happens when they catch fire, because they're packed to the gills with gunpowder, because their only purpose is to fire their batteries. There's about 200 guns spread across these 10 floating batteries and 5,000 men packed onto them. And just on the right here, you're actually the small craft, a British gunboats, as they're known, and they will actually go to the rescue of some of the Spanish crews to try and help them get them out of these flaming wrecks. And I mentioned George Carter's more famous painting. This is it. This is in the collection of the National Army Museum in the UK. This is George Carter's painting of the floating batteries of flame. They're on the right, on the lower right is of the painting, but on the left as you're looking at it, that big bastion jutting out, that's William Greene's King's Bastion. On the right, you've got the general staff of the British looking on. Some of them that look like they have faded uniforms. Again, that's that silk uniform that Greene's wearing in our portrait. And Greene is in this detail shot here. He's the gentleman standing to the left with the rolled map. So again, one of his plans of the fortifications. So that's William Greene there from a contemporary image. You may know this image though. This is John Singleton Copley's more famous illustrative picture of the burning batteries. Greene in this image is just to the right as you're looking at it, of Eliot on his white horse. He's just to the right looking up, kind of in awe of Eliot. And it's, as you can see, there's quite a similarity between these 2 compositions, and it's widely thought that Copley is influenced by George Carter's work there. The aftermath. So the Great Siege, as it's known, lasted in an incredible 1,300 days, from the 21st of June, 1779 to the 2nd of February, 1783. And it is officially known as the longest siege in British history, which, if you know anything about British military history, that's kind of saying something. In terms of British casualties, they'll lose about 1,000 dead from enemy action, as well as the illness like the smallpox I mentioned earlier. About 1,000 will sadly be wounded. But in terms of the alliance's casualties, so France and Spain, we're talking nearly 4,000 dead and wounded. And the Great Siege, well, this is one of the key things to sort of take away, if you like. The Great Siege will pool these resources. So I've mentioned you've got fleets being involved, you've got all these gun crews, you're talking about engineers, you're talking about infantry soldiers. They're being pulled away where they could have been used in North America to fight in Europe. Post-war, a little bit about Greene after the siege. Well, he'll come home to great acclaim. He'll be personally thanked by both houses of Parliament, so that's the Commons and the Lords. He'll become a baronet in 1786, eventually gaining the full rank of general, 1798, later retiring on pension. And lastly, of course, Gibraltar continues its importance to the UK to this day, very much in the news if you follow any of the discussions in post-Brexit Europe. Lastly, in summary, Well, William Green's portrait, we are so very fortunate to have here at the Society of the Cincinnati. It's a fantastic resource to talk about the wider Revolutionary War and discuss the fact that it was fought globally, not just in North America, and it involved great powers such as Spain and eventually the Dutch to some degree, a more limited degree than the other powers I've been mentioning. But thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it, and I am ready to take some questions from you, great people.
Great, thank you, Paul. To start things off here, I'm going to throw you the first question, which is, why did you choose this portrait to present on? I know that there's a lot of objects and treasures in the collections here. What interests you the most about this?
So why did I pick this? Very, very good question. Thank you for asking. I just obviously. As Andrew mentioned at the beginning, I'm British, so I have a certain leaning, shall we say, to the British side of things. And William Green is interesting because he's not terribly famous now. So I always like stories to bring where I can bring things out. Like William Green, not terribly known now. Let's bring that out. What did he do? And the fact that this painting tells you what he did, it points to all these clues of his story, is really rather wonderful. And Gibraltar, it's all growing up in the UK. I've always known of Gibraltar. It's kind of this. There's always been a big Royal Naval base. In many different campaigns, it pops up again and again and again as being an important bastion of the British in the Mediterranean. So I was just very much drawn to it. Yeah.
Excellent. Another question is, are there any fortifications that were designed by Green still standing today?
Interestingly, Gibraltar now, they've reclaimed land from the sea over the years. So it's actually a little bit bigger than it was at this time that we're talking about the Great Siege. So the King's Bastion is there. Two of the other major bastions that Green worked on, one known as the Orange Bastion, and the other one I forget now off the top of my head, but they are still there. And some of the cannons are still in place there. So yeah, we're quite fortunate that they are there. And King's Bastion is actually home to a leisure centre now. Anyway, so that gives you this really hard balancing act because Gibraltar is so very small, so they have to work around British defences. They've got Moorish castles from the medieval period. They've got World War II fortifications as well.
We have another question. Was there any assistance from what is now Morocco?
Who said that? Someone knows the subject. Is there any assistance from Morocco? Yes, Morocco, across the 50 miles away, played an interesting role throughout the siege. This is touching on the fact that there's way more than I could ever do justice to in a 30-minute presentation about the siege of Gibraltar. But in terms of Morocco, what we're looking at is merchants, very savvy merchants are trying to, not officially from the government of Morocco, from the emperor, you got savvy merchants trying to come in, break the blockade and trade their goods. But then what ends up happening is to make sure that the Moroccans, who are technically neutral, don't come in to help officially, the Spanish will actually pay off the Moroccan government so that they don't come in to aid Gibraltar officially, as I said.
Great. Is there any particular book that you can recommend that discusses Gibraltar a little bit more in depth?
Yes, so any particular book? Great question. So the two most modern books that I definitely recommend, you've got The Great Siege. It's simply known as The Great Siege. And I think that the subtitle is The Greatest Siege in British History. That's from the Adkins, husband and wife. Came out only in the last 5 years. Very, very good, very readable. And it uses a lot of the prior good accounts too, which I'll get into. Another, just a concise book that I like is one of the Osprey books. That's from René Chartrand. He's done a really good, concise account of what Gibraltar was with some historical context. And then if you're going way back, you've got Colonel Drinkwater. Yes, that is his name. Colonel Drinkwater has an account. He was actually at the Siege of Gibraltar and he released an account, which is very, very good. And then the Adkins, who I mentioned, they actually cite him greatly in their work. Very good account. And he was there. So it adds quite a interesting perspective.
Another question from Mark. Do the British still have an armed presence on Gibraltar?
Good question. The British still have an armed presence on Gibraltar? They do. I feel like it is small. It's a lot smaller than the garrison that we were talking about in the 1770s, about 5,000. I think it's only about 1,000 personnel there now in terms of the army. Navy's always in and out because they use it to refit from their Mediterranean fleet. And then they have an airfield they have access to. It was built for them in World War II. So they do have that. And I just saw, I think this week they were performing live exercises on the Rock. So yes, the British Army is very much there.
You discussed how the siege took away from precious resources for the British during the Revolutionary War that could have been utilized in the Atlantic, in North America, across the Atlantic. What was the impact of this?
Good question. I know, I'm glad you asked, because I do have some other accounts that go into the fact, like in terms of numbers, that we're talking about how did it affect the North American theatre. So if you know Don Hagist, a great historian that specializes in the British Army of the Revolutionary period, he actually wrote and found accounts from the British National Archives in London, where there, at least in one instance, there were 800 men that were recruited specifically for the North American theatre. So 800 men were going to be put on ships, sent across to the war, but they were then rerouted or routed. because I know my mum's watching in England, but they were rerouted to Gibraltar ahead of what they expected to be the likely siege. So that's 800 men in one instance going the other way. And I've mentioned the three relieves, naval relieves. In one instance with the first, which was Admiral Rodney, the British Admiralty carefully had his fleet. It was going to North America initially, but they just had him go to Gibraltar on the way. And he had some of his fleet detach and go to Gibraltar and stay there, and the bulk went to North America. But the other instances, they're actually fleets that specifically put together to go to Gibraltar's aid. So in the case of Derby, that's springtime 1781. And of course, you've got the famous French sailor de Grasse sailing over roughly the same time to the Caribbean and then up to eventually North America. So you've got assets being moved one way, whereas the French are going the other way. And of course, that fleet will be crucial to bottle it in Cornwallis's troops at Yorktown.
Great. So I think that's where we are going to wrap it up. I want to thank you very much, Paul, for a great presentation and for kicking off the first lunch bite of our Spring Historical Programs calendar. Before we officially conclude, I would like to point out that as you all leave today's program, Google Form survey will appear on your screen. We kindly ask that you share your thoughts about today's program, as well as any suggestions you have for other topics that you would like us to cover in our future historical programming. As always, your feedback is most helpful as we develop that calendar. Additionally, I'd also like to invite you to visit our events page on our website, www.americanrevolutioninstitute.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming historical programs that we have just posted through April. Our next historical program is an author's talk that will be held virtually on Zoom Thursday, February 3rd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It will feature Dr. Kylie Holbert, who will discuss her new book, The Untold War at Sea, America's Revolutionary Privateers. Registration is currently open for that, as well as all of our other future historical programs. Now, on behalf of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us and for your continued support of our mission. And with that, I would like to wish you all a great day and a great weekend. So thank you, Paul, and thank you, everybody. Take care.